So there's confusion, and the SNP, which is the Scottish National Party, has come out with 27 gender categories, from
Nice.
genderqueer to pangender.
What's aughty gender? Do I want to know?
But what you'll notice is man and woman aren't there.
No,
We're cisgender.
just cisgender.
Trans masculine, trans man, it's all so crazy.
Yeah, that's an old one though, the trans mask, right? That's where women who are kind of tomboyish, but they're not 100% committed.
It's
There's
a
a
spectrum.
boutique gender for everybody, for every stage. For them, it really is a
Mm.
spectrum, right?
Since for some reason we don't have a separation of state and gender,
Huh. No.
and we have these very reasonable, necessary norms being transgressed or queer, whatever you want to call it, then we take issue. Before I get into the amicus brief, there is a case going on in Scotland. There's a law that talks about gender identity, and then there's the Protections Act, where sex, of course, is one of the protected characteristics. So that you have companies or organizations that are acting as if the policy on gender recognition supersedes or negates the other one, you get into all these problems at the level of bathrooms and changing rooms. So the court's going to have to decide how to hash this out. An amicus brief is a legal document written by a non party to a legal case, offering information or arguments to assist the court in making its decision. So an amicus brief is a written submission to a court from a non-party, and it's called amicus curiae, which is Latin for friend of the court. I like that. I
Yes.
want to be the friend of the court. So the purpose of the amicus brief is to provide the court with information or arguments that the parties to the case may not have presented. They're typically filled the appellate level. Anyone or any organization with expertise or insight relevant to the case can file an amicus brief. For example, the American Psychological Association has filed nearly 250 amicus briefs, and the court has discretion over whether to consider the amicus briefs or not. So that's what an amicus brief is. I bring that up because many organizations who are trying to protect women's rights and legal protections file amicus briefs. And we're going to go over one that gives us an insight into the confusion that these policies have caused that end up playing out in bathrooms, changing rooms, and whatever. That it could be that someone's trying to do the right thing. These policies pass about gender identity recognition, all this stuff. And then, of course, you have organizations that are activists who I'm sure are going out to educate or inform various sectors about how they can make sure that they're, including their trans colleagues and customers who may either not know or conveniently not mention the need to balance this between women's rights and legal protections. So anyway, this amicus brief that Sex Matters submitted to the court will help clear out what some of the problems are. Would you mind reading this, Tanya?
Intervention to the Supreme Court on the definition of sex. Briefing on the intervention by Sex Matters. Sex Matters, represented by Ben Cooper KC and David Welsh, is intervening in the appeal in the case of Four Women Scotland versus Scottish Ministers, which will be heard by the Supreme Court on the 26th and 27th of November 2024. The key question: should the meaning of sex brackets man woman in the Equality Act of 2010 be read as being modified by section 9 brackets 1 of the Gender Recognition Act, which says that on obtaining a GRC, which is a gender recognition certificate, quotation, if the acquired gender is the male gender, the person's sex becomes that of a man, and if it is the female gender, the person's sex becomes that of a woman. Hmm.
What does sex mean? We argue that the Gender Recognition Act cannot, in fact, alter a person's biology or the related needs or the perceptions or beliefs of others, and these remain salient to the purposes of the Equality Act. So here's the two acts. You have the Equality Act, and then later there was the Gender Recognition Act. So which one are people supposed to follow, and how do you deal with conflicts between the two? In enacting the Equality Act, Parliament chose to protect people from discrimination based on sex and gender reassignment as separate characteristics, which is already a problem. Anyway, and a reading of sex in the Equalities Act as being modified by gender recognition certificate is not necessary to meet the legislative purposes of either the Equality Act or the Gender Recognition Act, would lead to absurd. Okay, sorry. A reading of sex in the Equalities Act is being modified by a gender recognition certificate. First of all, is not necessary to meet the legislative purposes of either act, would lead to absurd, unjust, and irrational results, would run counter to the legislative purposes of the Equality Act, and would infringe on the rights of women and girls under Articles 8 and 10. Our experience and research highlights how uncertainty and ambiguity about the circumstances in which it is legitimate to treat biological women and girls as a distinct group has a practical effect that many organizations feel inhibited from doing so at all or compelled to adopt a self ID approach. I think this is obviously quite true. We see this playing out everywhere.
Hmm.
A lot of companies or organizations are thinking it's the easiest way to go, self ID and okay. And then when people have an issue with it, people aren't going to want to get into that. So if they can quiet it down, and then of course people will self censor because women and girls don't want to be called transphobes or bigots or mean. And if you see people
Yeah.
around you going along with it,
Yeah.
and you see people in positions of authority going along with it, it becomes
Yeah.
difficult to stand up against it. But fortunately, there are people who are doing so. So, Tanya,
Can man and woman have variable meanings across the act? The previous judgment suggested that the meanings of man and woman may vary across the Equality Act. We disagree. The term sex and related expressions must be given a consistent meaning across the whole of the Equality Act. The principles of statutory interpretation, the context of the statute as a whole is important. Words should be given a constant and predictable interpretation. A statutory definition has the effect that whenever this expression is used in this act, this is what it means. And the other box, in relation to the Equality Act, the protected characteristics provide the foundations for the whole architecture of the Equality Act. The protected characteristics of sex is defined by reference to man and woman, and the Act provides definitions for man and woman.
you believe we have to do this?
Okay.
What's next? What's the next obvious thing we're gonna have to go through this whole process with? Who knows? The purpose of both the Equality Act and the Gender Recognition Act must be considered. We argue that Section 9(1) of the Gender Recognition Act is a deeming provision. The law on deeming provisions tells us that they should be applied only insofar as it is necessary to achieve their purpose and not so far as to produce unjust, absurd, and anomalous results.
Hmm.
So this means that a lot is going to depend on what is determined to be unjust, absurd, or an anomalous result. The problem is if a man gets a gender recognition, then I can understand why he and other people assume that means, okay, well, then we treat them as if they're a woman,
Of
which
course, if you get a
is
hunting
they're not.
license, right? And someone's like, "Hey, what are you doing shooting all these pheasants?" "Well, I've got a hunting license. What do you expect me to do with it?"
Yeah.
"I'm
What
gonna
is
use
it
it."
if not basically a license to get into places where men would not be typically allowed into?
No, you pay for the hunting license. If you're
Yeah.
not gonna use it, then why do you have it? It's not like, "Oh, I need this hunting license to feel good about myself." No, you bought it. You're using it. You filled it out. You did all that
Yeah.
work. You went to the bureau. I don't
Yeah.
have a hunting license, by the way. Just popped into my head.
No, I don't
Well,
have a GRA. My gender has not been recognized.
no, can you imagine?
It'd be a bit redundant. Anyway, okay, so the Gender Recognition Act is a deeming provision, and that means it's supposed to be implied only insofar necessary to achieve their purposes, whatever that is, and not to produce unjust, absurd, or anomalous results. So, is it necessary to achieve the purposes of either the Gender Recognition Act or the Equality Act? Or would it undermine the purposes, coherence, or effectiveness of the law otherwise produce unjust, absurd, or anomalous results? So my guess is what the issue is. Let's say is letting men who identify as women
Mm,
and have this piece of paper that the government says, okay, we recognize that you want to identify as a woman. So
mm,
is this necessary to achieve the purpose of either the act or would it
mhm,
undermine it?
mm,
So Gender Recognition Act addresses the difficulties and anomalies resulting from a lack of legal recognition for
Mm.
transsexual people in relations with the state, such as marriage, pensions, retirement, and Social Security. The Equality Act of 2010 prevents unfavorable treatment of individuals because of their protected characteristics by employers, service providers, and others.
Clarity about how to identify the relevant groups is crucial for the group based rights and protections to operate effectively. The group based rights and protections, such as indirect discrimination, positive action, the public sector equality duty, and the exceptions that allow single sex services, sports, associations, and charities, recognize that a group who share a particular characteristic have common experiences, needs, and disadvantages. It is a need of both sexes, brackets, but particularly women, to have privacy from members of the opposite sex in situations of undressing and bodily contact, unless they consent otherwise. Our submissions consider how a S9 bracket 1 reading of sex in the Equality Act compared with a biological reading would affect 1. The composition and coherence of the relevant groups in terms of their shared characteristics, interests, and needs. 2. The ability of duty bearers, such as employers and service providers, to identify and coherently analyze the effects of their policies and practices on the relevant groups.
Applying the GRA, Gender Recognition Act, to Equality Act produces absurd effects.
Mm.
Applying the reading of sex in the Equality Act would mean the reference to a woman would include most biological females and some biological males, while reference to men would include most biological males and some biological females. There is nothing that a group of some females plus some male people with the certificate have in common beyond state documentation. This leads to absurd results. Yes.
Totally.
And the thing is, on the legal front in particular, is, and some of us may not think about this if we haven't had to, that it's very important for laws to be precise
Yeah,
for obvious
kidding.
reasons.
No kidding.
It's the weight of law and being able to
Really is.
know who it applies to and who it doesn't, and when you're breaking it and when you're not. Seems kind of important.
Right. Yeah.
But so they ask, could Parliament have really intended that biological women and girls, or men and boys, are not protected by group based rights and protections? That bearers are regulated by reference to categories that can only be ascertained by knowledge of a confidential certificate? That people with protected characteristics of gender reassignment are considered differently depending on whether they possess a certificate?
Yeah.
So there's more to this amicus brief, and if you go to the Sex Matters website, you can see any other
Right.
ones that they filed. But this is basically the gist of it. And to me, it's quite clear. It's such an obvious contradiction,
Mm.
especially in law and when it matters, is that you cannot have women being adult human females and also men who identify as women. How is that going to work?
Right.
Unless you really convince yourself that there are two types of women that are equal,
Yeah.
that have equal standing to the category of woman, which in itself is mystical. Another reason why I wanted to bring this up is because you can understand why there's so much confusion.
Yeah.
Even though I would hope that if I had a business or was responsible for the decision, for example, to change the women's room to a gender neutral room, would think about it a second.
Yeah.
But who knows? You could have people that come in, and especially with human resources, and there's organizations like Stonewall that go out and basically ouster turf everybody with how they can make sure they're in compliance with these
Yeah. Yeah.
policies.
Yeah.
And if they,
Yeah, they
and
get
then if they,
scores, right?
yeah, and if all they're telling people about is the GRA, and if the people don't know
Right.
until there's a kerfuffle,
Right.
and then people want to put their head in the sand or they don't want to deal with it, then eventually it goes to court. And so now I think this is what we're going to see, not just in Scotland, but any place that has these law contradictions. This is going to be
Yeah.
playing out in court, and that takes some time. And it isn't that convenient. Sometimes I wonder if
Mm.
the politicians that realize what a mess they've created just want to wait it out and let the courts hash it out for them, so they don't have to take the blame.
Yeah. I wonder about that. I know I'm super cynical, but I think that there are some who understand that things went too far and are expecting and happy with them just moving back to not where we were before when things were normal, men were men, women are women, no confusion. But some men, even though we're not calling them women, we're not touching kids, but I think some people went crazy just so that we could move back to a different spot than we were at the beginning
Mm.
and seem rational. Does that make sense? Without me explaining badly?
We're figuring this out as we go. It's hard to process
Totally.
what's happened and what's happening.
Right,
So it's not surprising that we're at a loss of words
right.
sometimes.
When the Japanese government passed the gender policy, after a lot of lobbying by the US Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, when the lawmakers went to vote, a bunch of them went to the toilet and they didn't vote. They said they had a stomach ache. In Japan, when you have a stomach ache, everyone's like, oh my God, you got a stomach ache. Jesus, we better go take care of that. It reminded me of those old stories of someone didn't want to swear allegiance to the king or the feudal lord, so didn't turn up and had made some excuse, right? And so here
Mhm.
you have lawmakers, instead of voting yes or no, oh, sorry, toilet,
Yeah.
stomach ache. That's insane.